We're here to talk about big data this morning. I think this year has been dominated by big data. Everybody's talking about it, and it seems to feature in every aspect of our lives. Professionally, it's changing the way we analyse and evaluate virtually everything. And personally, I think we're all there contributing to big data with our ever-increasing digital footprint. So it is actually us as well. The reason we've produced this presentation in this paper really sprang out of this spring's conference and seminar season, where there was a great deal of talk about big data, how wonderful big data was, and how it's going to radically change the way we do things. But at the end of all the debates, someone, normally a vendor of big data, then said, and of course you won't really need those, sometimes said, sometimes implied, puny little research data sets that you're using at the moment, and they would soon be a thing of the past. So in the face of such data imperialism, we felt at the IPA that we should have an independent view of big data and how it will impact on audience research. And we were very fortunate in that Richard Marks agreed to write the paper for us. Richard, who now has his own company, Research the Media, has a great deal of experience both in big data and in audience research and integrating the two. So he's ideally placed, I think, to give us an impartial view of big data and of audience research, and to look at each one, to look at the pros and cons. The question, will big data vanquish all other types of data sets in the coming years? And really, what does the future hold? But first of all, he's going to start at the very beginning. And the key question, what does big data actually mean? Over to Richard. Thank you.
Thanks. So big data, as Lynn was saying, is certainly a term that's caught people's imagination. And I wrote an article, I think about 3 months ago, saying that big data was a rubbish name and it should be called deep data. So my reward is to give a presentation in which I'll use the words big data about 50 times. So there's a certain irony there. But as Lynn was saying, big data is everywhere. I did make the mistake of emailing this presentation to Lynn last week. So the NSA have now cleared it for terrorist threat because their big data in the PRISM database now has allowed them to access it. But as we discussed, that it really is everywhere. There's dozens of recently published books on big data, about one a week on Amazon, everything from big data for dummies to big data for chimps. Apparently chimps is some form of a IT term, not literally. However, almost all these texts focus on either the business applications of big data or the IT implications of storing brontobytes or zettabytes worth of data. Yes, there is something called a brontobyte if you're interested. I'm now going to be focusing, however, on the relative merits of media research and big data. I'm not going to be talking about things like Hadoop, Oracle, storage databases. It's going to be a challenge to squeeze big data into a small presentation, but I'm going to give it a go for the next 15, 20 minutes or so. But this really is only an overview of what the report contains. Firstly, though, we need to agree what we mean by big data in a research and planning context. In the world of media research, arguably there are four most relevant types of big data. Granular media usage data derived directly from set-top boxes, web servers, ISPs, mobile networks, and user databases. Online user data gathered by the media owners themselves. Service provider data from search engines like Google and social media like Facebook and Twitter. And finally, and most importantly in terms of single source, customer purchase or user data derived either from online behavior or EPOS data integrated with customer loyalty information. So, some people have claimed that deep data, that big data, is only really created when you actually add two data sets together to create something bigger. But throughout this presentation, I'm going to stick with that term big data, probably to the point where you'll be fed up with me saying it. What is clear is that in the context of media research and audience measurement, big data does constitute a revolution. However, any historian will point out that revolutions are often bloody and messy, and that the eventual winners are often not the people who man the barricades at the start. In any case, I don't believe that big data will wash away the established order. Typically, innovation takes its place within the media ecosystem. It improves and complements, but it very rarely totally replaces. You can see this evolution model if we look back a couple of decades to when EPOS scanning data came in. It didn't wipe out consumer research, but there was a refocusing around how research was used. And certainly services like WorldPanel and HomeScan adapted to incorporate its use, and attitudinal studies like TGI continue to this day. Undoubtedly, one of the key strengths of big data is its granularity, the sheer volume of it. It allows a closer look at media users and consumers than ever before. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to use this painting as a visual metaphor. It's liberty leading the people, Delacroix's 1830 depiction of the French Revolution. And this is a bitmap of 720 by 540 pixels. So that's about 39,000 dots or pieces of information, which sounds a lot, and it certainly gives a lovely view of the whole picture. But if I decide that I'm going to lean in and want to focus on this guy here, I do find that the resolution of the picture, the detail, does leave something to be desired. Not enough dots, not enough data for a close look. So I'm going to use big data and take the resolution up from 720 by 540 to an impressive 8 million pixels. As a result, if I now zoom in again, I get a much clearer view of this reprobate. I can see the paint strokes in much sharper definition, more detail than was possible on the original picture, which had less pixels, less sample to play with. You can see where I'm going with this metaphor. I'm not going to over-labour it, but having set that up, I will come back to this metaphor. This ability to make things clearer, the granularity of big data, is a game changer. Up to now, we've been constrained by the sheer cost of accumulating market research samples, which have limited measurement of the growing long tail of niche media, that zooming in, and also has handicapped the usefulness of single source data, where we may want to overlay brands with products. So granularity is a key strength of big data. Meanwhile, big data is possible because, as Lynn was saying, we create it. Media and consumer behaviour leaves a digital trail. It's collected passively rather than people having to recall what they did. As a result, this allows a far more detailed measurement of the long tail of digital consumption, and I'm nothing if not literal in my charts. The opportunity for instant or close to instant feedback is exciting. We are in a real-time age. And meanwhile, data collected as a side product of activity, our activity, digital exhaust as some people call it, is inevitably far cheaper to gather than bespoke survey research, particularly as the costs of storage plummet. The final strength I'm going to highlight in an audience measurement context is data overlays, single source. Up to now, even the most expensive single source sample surveys like Apollo in the US struggled with having enough data to look at anything but the biggest campaigns. Once you overlaid a brand with a channel, you started to struggle. However, when big data on media use is overlaid with big data from purchasing, the ability to see how one form of behaviour, media exposure, has influenced another, consumption, is a quantum leap forward for media planning and return on investment. Now, some big data proponents have argued that what people do is really all you need now, and that statistically analysing what people do will indicate why they did it through correlation and pattern recognition. However, this can run the risk of a new word I discovered in my research, apophenia, which is seeing correlations and patterns that are not actually there. It's much beloved of conspiracy theorists. Also, big data typically only measures the final act, the click that orders the product. But for many brands and products, that final click is the end of a media journey that's seen them exposed to many different messages across a range of media. Many campaigns are as much about changing attitudes and consideration as they are about short-term purchase. So, We do believe that there will always be a need for attitudinal data to complement audience measurement, as opposed to just purchasing behaviour being the be-all and end-all. Meanwhile, it's a dangerous assumption, and yes, I was at Wembley Stadium on Saturday, particularly prevalent amongst non-statisticians, that big automatically means beautiful, that the most important characteristic of a sample is simply its size. And if you're not a statistician, it's a very comforting thing to do, just count the number of zeros. But that's not the only health check that matters. And it may sound boring to say it, but sample balance, a high response rate, and data quality control are also critical in how usable a data set is. I do know from my own experiences working with return path data that a lot of work is needed to turn something that's raw data into usable, correct, and actionable insights. And it's dangerous to assume that just because they're big data sets are inherently correct. They can easily contain mistakes or biases, just as survey research can. So if big data is indeed oil, it needs refining. You wouldn't put crude oil in your car and expect to have a good journey. The mission of the industry currencies is to represent the whole UK population, and that means balance, not just raw numbers. And I don't often put up full sentences on charts, but if there's one key thing from today, and hopefully you'll agree, it's that a controlled sample of, for example, 1,000 adults with a high response rate will always be more representative than even 1 million customers drawn from an imbalanced, self-selecting or partial sample. Okay, so I mentioned the industry surveys. What are their strengths compared to big data? What do they bring to the party? Well, they are obviously the trading currency, which means as a result, they're transparent in their methodologies, typically overseen by a technical committee, which we all love being on, which give reassurance as to the quality and the representativeness of the data. Usually, no black boxes are involved. They have balanced representative samples, so the samples may be small, but they are perfectly formed. As a result, the data is typically available to all, which is often not the case for big data, which, whilst cheaper to produce, is usually owned and leveraged for commercial advantage. This also means that big data's derivation is often less than transparent. As they're survey-based, the industry surveys do have extensive demographics at an individual level. Typically, the size of big data can be in inverse proportion to the availability of demographics for it due to privacy limitations. This can mean that the demographics may be modelled, may only be available at a household level, or are being dismissed as irrelevant. It's perhaps cynical to say it, but those who argue that demographics aren't important are typically those who don't have access to them in the first place. This doesn't mean the absence or limited availability of demographics means big data is therefore not of use, but it does again amplify the continued importance of the industry surveys, which do provide actual individual level demographic detail. It could be argued, and if we come back to our painting, that without detailed demographics, many big data sets are fairly black and white. They aren't able to produce the full picture in living colour. So using survey data to bring colour to big data by adding demographics is a huge opportunity to bring those data sets to life. Finally, and critically, we're used to our industry surveys providing not just detailed feedback on the performance of our piece of content or advertising, but also the wider context. How did we perform relative to the market? What's usual? What constitutes success? What's the benchmark? A key challenge for big data is that it typically can represent a part of the picture, but not the whole. Denied that wider context and competitive information, media owners and advertisers would find themselves in a solipsistic bubble. I've always wanted to use the word solipsistic in a presentation, with a detailed knowledge of their own customers' behaviour, but blind to the rest of the market. These high-resolution data sets give us a great view of a part of the market, a particular platform, a particular customer base, a particular mobile phone network. This level of detail is really the strength of big data, as we've discussed. And up to a point, you could argue that's okay. After all, there is a growing focus on customer retention, ARPU, lifetime value, and share of wallet. And brands can now analyse their own proprietary data sets gathered from their own digital assets. However, customer acquisition relies on an understanding of the wider market, of competitor performance, and that's what's in danger of being lost if the media owners and advertisers take their ball and go home with it in terms of retreating into their own data silos. They can be masters of their own domain, but with only a blurry, limited view of the outside world. And really that's where audience research and the industry currency specifically can contribute, giving an overview of the market, which whilst, yes, it may have less dots, it may be less detailed, it does mean that big data can be slotted in and better understood, providing both granular detail and total market context. This is something that Barb are investigating with their Dovetail initiative, which Justin announced on Monday. Whilst in the US, Nielsen has already committed to augmenting its measurement of the local markets with return path data. And both SKO in Holland and MMS in Sweden publish online streaming data already alongside the industry TV currencies. However, a word of warning, for this vision of coexistence and mutual benefit to work, it's essential that big data sets are clearly labelled in terms of what they represent and what they don't. There can be a danger, particularly amongst those promoting the data sets, to claim they can do everything. A data set that represents all subscribers to a particular mobile network, for example, can give a very useful and granular look at how those particular subscribers behave. However, on its own, it's unlikely to be somehow projectable to the total UK universe, no matter how large the sample is. Unfortunately, this aspect can get lost, either in the marketing of a new service, which can be reticent to remind potential users or investors about the limitations of a product, or due to a simple, genuine misunderstanding of where the data comes from in the first place. Or perhaps more dangerously, attempts are made to take a part of the market and by using clever algorithms, attempt to project across the total market and say, look, we can represent the total market, we can project back out from what we do know. Now, obviously I'm not dissing the whole of statistical modelling because we have our SMB people in the audience. The key point though is it's vital for a big data user to understand where did a data set come from, what does it include and what does it not include. So it's essential to have a balanced view, and I think this is probably the other really key chart. Certainly I would contend that just because a data set is representative of something doesn't mean you consume it represents everything. However, some people will go too far down that argument in dismissing all big data. The converse, though, is that just because something doesn't cover everything doesn't mean it can't give you a very valid and representative view of what it does represent. Clarity is everything when it comes to big data. Another dimension I believe we have to take consideration of is the need for a consumer-centric view of media research and media consumption. There's been a growing understanding, helped by the IPA, that to truly understand behaviour, we need to map media onto consumers, not map consumers onto individual media silos. I think over the last decade there's been a lot of progress towards this, not least with the IPA's own touchpoints. The key point is that we're seeking to measure the people who are using the devices, not just the devices themselves. However, at an extreme, all that progress will be lost if all that this big data revolution means is that we replace one set of media industry silos with another set of proprietary data silos. In a media research context, I think the key to it all lies in the essentially complementary nature of big data with the industry surveys. In the report, we go into that into a lot more in a lot more detail, along with some other relevant aspects of big data. These include data verification and also privacy issues, which can and has made up whole reports in itself. However, I'm going to focus on one final aspect, which is the implications of big data for analyst and researcher skill sets, for our industry itself. So let's get existential. At one extreme, some have argued that big data will largely remove the need for analysts and researchers at all, that the machines, as in Terminator, will quite literally take over. This is an early comment for an article that Chris Anderson of Wired wrote in 2008, and he took a very extreme view, and I just paused to let you read it. So very much, he could have been in that French Revolution, very much dismissing the past. With enough data, the numbers will speak for themselves. So if you take that to its logical point, in this somewhat worrying view of the future, perhaps the research department of the next decade will be a computer, a man, and a dog. The computer will do all the work, and the dog will make sure that the man doesn't attempt to touch the computer. However, I don't think that will happen, and neither does Nate Silver. Now, he's the analyst who so accurately predicted the outcome of the recent US election, and his reward for doing that was that his blog became part of the New York Times itself. And he certainly sees a clear role for human input, and he does directly address that quote from Chris Anderson. The numbers have no way of speaking for themselves. We speak for them. So, I do think there is still going to be a role for human beings in market research, which is good because I'm still a few years off retirement. However, clearly the market research industry is going to change. The traditional research agencies will still have a role to play as they can provide the objectivity and open access that, with the best will in the world, those digital companies that produce big data as a side product of their core businesses cannot. The advent of the big data era presents questions about how analysts and researchers will themselves behave and what skills they'll need, and in particular, the balance between research agency and client-side data skills. It may be that the proliferation of big data will require an expansion of client-side resource to make sense of it all. Client analysts may become more like personal shoppers for their companies, evaluating the research and big data sets, and in some cases improving external and in-house data that's available, hopefully using some of the criteria outlined in our document. I do believe that there will continue to be a role for survey-based research amongst all that mathematics. However, for research agencies, there may be a subtle shift in their role to become both creators and curators of data. And a former colleague of mine, Nick Nyan, put it very eloquently when he said that up to now, research agencies have been primarily farmers of data, designing and growing bespoke research data, lovingly tending their crops of respondents and bringing data to the client to analyse. Arguably, the skill set and role is evolving to becoming more like chefs, selecting a combination of homegrown and bought-in big data to cook insightful business meals for clients. Big data may shift the balance of what analysts and researchers do and where they reside in the advertising ecosystem, but I do firmly believe that the need will remain for the human factor in appraising and analysing big data sets and, of course, research data sets. So if there's one thread running through this whole presentation, it's this. In order to maximise the opportunities provided by big data and industry audience surveys, the skilled data purchaser and user, the data shopper, needs to be asking the right questions. So in the report, which Lynn will be handing out a summary of in a moment, we provide a handy guide with 10 questions to ask before using big data and 10 questions to ask about industry research. I was thinking about it yesterday. It's a bit like mirror signal maneuver. It's not detailed stuff, but if you're going to use stuff, you want to make sure you don't have a data crash. So I'll leave you to enjoy those at your leisure, and that ends my short taster of the report. I hope you enjoy reading it, and vive la révolution!